It was another cold, snowy winter day in Western Canada, or at least it was supposed to be, which means my regular automotive projects were in hibernation, and I was looking for something to do.
Let's get out of the shot.
So I consulted the wheel of mediocre white guy hobbies.
Close one.
This is my good knife. It cost about $12 from Canadian Tire, it's never been sharpened, I wash it in the dishwasher, and I use it literally every day. My goal, as someone with absolutely no experience who's done almost no research, was to make a better knife than this from scratch. Being a complete beginner and inferior male specimen, I didn't already own a forge, and being a massive cheapskate, I wasn't keen on buying one. Instead, I opted to build my own forge, out of a brake drum from the junkyard, some black pipe from Home Depot, a travel hairdryer from Goodwill, and some cinder blocks from my neighbor's retaining wall. Okay, this is my DIY forge. The brake drum up top is where the hot coals go, and that's where we heat up the metal. This opening here allows us to blow air up into the brake drum, which fans the coals and allows them to get very, very hot. And then this down here is just a little trap that'll catch any coals that fall out of the brake drum into the tube, and that way they don't fall into whatever I'm going to use to blow air through here and destroy it. Luckily, I come from a long line of redneck trash, so I do already own an anvil. I've said this before in other videos, but everybody should own an anvil. This was given to me by my grandfather. It was just a farm anvil forever, so they used it to do farm shit. I don't know. It's probably 100 years old. I don't know if it's a real anvil or what a blacksmith would call an anvil-shaped object, but this is going to be completely fine for my purposes. I'm not sending knights into war here. Yet. They say you want something incredibly sturdy under your anvil to minimize energy loss, so I opted for this extremely flimsy folding table. I didn't have any coal on hand to fuel my forge since I'm not a train conductor from the 1800s, so instead I used regular lump charcoal like you'd use to cook burgers. This did work fairly well, but I found that at forging temps, the charcoal burned inconveniently fast. I chose to use this big cold chisel as the starting point for my knife. At the time, it seemed like a good choice because it's some kind of tool steel, and I'd be able to use the existing hexagon shape as the knife handle. Both of these justifications turned out to be flawed in ways that I'll explain later. Once I'd gotten the chisel glowing orange, I began the process of hammering it flat and trying to shape it into a rough knife shape. I didn't really have a strategy here, but I found the hammering process fairly intuitive, and the chisel steel nice to work with. What I didn't find nice to work with was my anvil situation. This is the first big lesson I learned. Anvil setup is very important. Sitting on top of this table, my anvil is way too high up. This means that I can't hit it with much power, and trying is an ergonomic nightmare that's killing my shoulder. The folding table is also probably one of the dumbest ideas I've ever had. Since it's flimsy, it absorbs all the power from my swings, meaning I'm working way harder to flatten the metal than I would be if I had a proper anvil stand. I was able to mitigate the problem somewhat by switching the anvil to this wooden workbench, which was slightly more sturdy but still way too tall. The second big lesson I learned was tongs. Pliers aren't tongs. Vice grips aren't tongs. These aren't long enough to keep the heat off my hands, and they don't grip well enough to keep the metal still while hammering. Despite the shortcomings in my setup, I was able to get a good rhythm going of heating, hammering, and tending the fire. Eventually, I ended up with something that I felt was pretty knife-shaped. Now, this is the part that's probably going to confuse experienced knife makers. Since I didn't have a proper belt grinder, I decided to grind the knife to shape with my oscillating belt sander, which I figured would work just as good. Which brings me to lesson 3. Nope, not really. This was the wrong tool for the job. This is also when I realized why keeping the handle three-dimensional was a mistake. It limits the angles you can use to grind the face down, which was especially inconvenient on this sander, which already has limited angles. Now, Jeff the editor knows that the correct order of operations here is to flatten the workpiece out, grind the bevels into it, and then give it an edge after heat treating. However, the Jeff in this footage is younger, dumber, and not nearly as handsome, and he doesn't know any of that. What he did instead was try to do all three of these things at the same time. So to recap, I was using the wrong tool to do the wrong thing. And then I broke the tool. Despite my overall incompetence, after cutting off the excess stock, I was left with something that looked quite a bit like an actual knife. Once I was happy with it, I moved on to the heat treat. This is the second issue with my decision to use a chisel as my metal. I have no clue what kind of steel it's made out of, and different steels require different heat treating methods to harden properly. Since I was already overwhelmed, I decided to keep things simple and quench with water. This seems to have done a good job hardening the metal, but I'd be surprised if it was optimal. I then went back with the belt sander to clean off all the scale that formed during the quench, and did my best to sharpen the edge. I did actually manage to get a fairly sharp edge doing this, but in hindsight it was probably more of an accident than anything. When the dust had settled, this is the finished product I ended up with. It's crude, sure, but you can't deny that it is a vaguely knife-shaped piece of metal. I tested it out on some random vegetables, and it actually cuts pretty good. It made short work of the onion and potato, but struggled with the yam. Overall, this thing cuts about as well as any of my other long-neglected kitchen knives. But what about our original goal? Did we beat the Canadian Tire knife? Is this my new good knife that I'll forever use to mince garlic and open Amazon packages? No. Obviously not. Look at the thing. It looks like a lawnmower blade. I am genuinely quite proud of it, and I can see myself using it as a camp knife or something, but it's clearly not a chef's knife. It's just too rough around the edges. But I'm not calling it quits. I will keep trying until I've vanquished the Red Menace. Here's what I plan to do differently on my second attempt to get better results. Number 1, I need a better belt grinder. This knife's biggest shortcoming is its lack of finish work and overall rough appearance. A better grinder will allow me to get a more professional finish on the next one. Number 2, make a real handle. While convenient, the chisel handle is very heavy and doesn't really give off kitchen vibes. Next time, I'll make a more traditional handle out of wood. And number 3, learn to heat treat properly. The guesswork heat treat I did might be good enough for this knife, but it won't be good enough for a serious contender. If you have any feedback on what I could have done better in this video, be sure to leave it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. But if that feedback is about how much I suck at cutting vegetables, you can keep it to yourself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.